Hello, welcome to our final lecture in Chapter 12 on moral arguments. Today we'll talk about the structure of moral arguments. Really all this stuff that we've been talking about with the nature of value judgments and the various moral theories, it's all been giving you sort of background information on the field of ethics or morality so that you can come better equipped to this section on the structure of moral arguments. So for this lecture, we'll talk about the naturalistic fallacy, and then we'll talk about the structure of moral arguments. So let's talk about the naturalistic fallacy. So some moral theories use facts about human nature as the basis for moral value judgments. But according to Baronet, this commits the following fallacy, called the naturalistic fallacy. It's an attempt to derive value judgments from statements of fact. So remember, a value judgment is something like, I like ice cream, or murder is wrong. And a statement of fact is something like, water is H2O. Now, that doesn't mean that value judgments aren't factual. It's just the sort of term that we've given to these two sorts of statements. Okay, so a naturalistic fallacy is an attempt to derive value judgments from statements of facts. It's a fallacy because an ethical pronouncement that you ought to do something cannot be logically deduced from the statements that assert only what is the case. So what you ought to do cannot be inferred from what is the case without having another sort of value judgment in between that allows you to make the inference. Okay, here's the naturalistic fallacy in action. Here's an argument. It is true that most people get pleasure from eating ice cream. Therefore, humans ought to eat ice cream. Now, this commits the naturalistic fallacy. It's going from a claim about what is the case, that most people get pleasure from eating ice cream, to a claim about what ought to be the case, that humans ought to eat ice cream. They should, morally speaking, eat ice cream. Now, the reason this is a fallacy is because you can't go from a statement of fact that people get pleasure from eating ice cream to the claim that people ought to eat ice cream. Okay. And I think it's clear in this case that maybe people ought not to eat ice cream, at least all the time, even if they get pleasure from it. Why? Because ice cream is high in calories and fat, because ice cream will have a negative impact on your health in the long term. It may cause diabetes if you're eating enough ice cream. Okay, so simply because people get pleasure from eating ice cream, it doesn't follow automatically that humans should eat ice cream. How about this next example? Owners of financially successful companies are more successful than poor people in the competition for wealth, power, and social status. Therefore, these owners are more morally better than poor people, and the poor deserve to be poor. Here, you're going from a claim about what is the case, that owners of financially successful companies are more successful than poor people in the competition for wealth, power, and social status. And then what you're claiming there is, from that statement of fact, matter of fact, you're claiming that something moral follows, that the rich are morally better than the poor, and that also that the poor deserve to be poor. That's too much of a leap. Just like it's a leap to go from people like eating ice cream to people should eat ice cream, it's a leap to go from the rich are more successful than the poor, therefore the rich are morally better than the poor. It's a leap. You need more information to be able to draw the conclusion in both arguments. So this is the naturalistic fallacy, where you're going from what is the case to what ought to be the case. We'll take that sort of fallacy, the knowledge of that fallacy, with us when we talk about the structure of moral arguments. So how can you avoid the naturalistic fallacy? In a naturalistic fallacy, an ought statement, a moral statement, is derived from an is statement, a fact statement. To bridge the gap between the is and the ought, we use a moral principle. That is, a moral argument needs a moral principle in its premises. You can't simply go from a premise about what is the case to a conclusion about what ought to be the case. What you need is a premise about what is the case, a moral principle as a premise, and then you need an ought conclusion. So here is the structure of moral arguments. There is at least one premise describing a particular situation where a decision to act will be made by someone. This is a non-moral statement, an is statement. So you've got someone who's making a decision to act. Then two, you have one premise, at least one, that provides a moral rule or principle or command. And then three, you've got the conclusion asserting that a specific action should be performed. Okay. And it doesn't need to be an action. It could be a character trait, right? It could be a character trait. You have a situation where you're concerned about whether someone has a good character or not. But let's stick with actions. Okay, so you've got someone wanting to commit a particular action. This is the is statement. You've got a moral rule or principle about how to act, and then you've got a conclusion asserting whether that specific action is right or wrong. Let's look at some examples. But first, why is 2 a requirement? 2 says there is at least one premise that supplies a moral rule, principle, or command. 2 says there is at least one premise that supplies a moral rule, principle, or command. Why is this required? Well, it fills in the gap described by the is-ought problem. The is-ought problem is the leap from an is statement to an ought statement. To fill in the gap is to provide an extra step so that it's no longer a leap, it's just a natural progression to the conclusion. That's A. B, it supplies the general moral rule or principle needed to derive a specific moral action or behavior. Okay, compare the following two arguments to see why 2 is a requirement. Some prisoners of war have been tortured while in U.S. custody. Therefore, the United States should stop torturing prisoners of war. Take that argument. Now consider the next argument. Some prisoners of war have been tortured while in U.S. custody. Therefore, the United States should continue torturing prisoners of war. Here we can clearly see that you need a moral principle to get to the conclusion, because you've got two arguments that have the same premise. They both say in their premise, some prisoners of war have been tortured while in U.S. custody, but they conclude opposite things. One says we should stop torturing, the other says we should continue torturing. Clearly, both are making a leap. What you need is some sort of moral principle that tells you whether or not you should torture prisoners of war. So you've got the is statement, some prisoners of war have been tortured while in U.S. custody. The moral conclusion, either the United States should stop or continue torturing prisoners of war. And then to fill in the gap, you need a moral principle about whether or not we should torture prisoners of war. Okay. Here I've given a moral principle to fill in the gap between the is statement and the ought statement. Some prisoners of war have been tortured while in U.S. custody. Torture is never morally acceptable. Therefore, the United States should stop torturing prisoners of war. Okay, now the conclusion follows. Now the conclusion follows from the present premises. You've got prisoners of war have been tortured. Torture is wrong. Therefore, the United States should stop torturing prisoners of war. The conclusion follows from the premises. You filled in the gap between the is and the ought with a moral principle. Let's see how well you answer the following questions about the structure of moral arguments. What component is missing from the structure of the following moral argument? Some prisoners of war have been tortured while in U.S. custody. Therefore, the United States should stop torturing prisoners of war. Are we missing A, a premise that is a non-moral is statement, B, a premise that supplies a moral rule, principle, or command, or C, a conclusion that a specific action should be performed. If you want, you could pause and think about it. Pause the lecture and think about it. But I'll just give you the answer. You're missing B, a premise that supplies a moral rule, principle, or command. Okay, so you have the non-moral premise. The non-moral premise, that is the fact statement, the is statement, says some prisoners of war have been tortured while in U.S. custody. That's the non-moral is statement. You've got C, a conclusion that a specific action should be performed. Therefore, the United States should stop torturing prisoners of war. So what you are missing is a premise that supplies a moral rule, principle, or command. What would that be? Something like we saw before. It is morally wrong to torture prisoners of war. Okay, what component is missing from the structure of the following moral argument? It is morally wrong to kill innocent human beings, therefore abortion is morally wrong. Are we missing a premise that is a non-moral is statement, a premise that supplies a moral rule, principle, or command, or a conclusion that a specific action should be performed? You can pause if you need to think about it. So it's not C. We definitely have a conclusion here. Therefore, as indicated by the word therefore, we see the conclusion, abortion is morally wrong. So we've got our conclusion that you shouldn't have abortions. We have a premise that supplies a moral rule, principle, or command. The moral rule, principle, or command is this. It is morally wrong to kill innocent human beings. So we have a morally, an ought premise, a moral premise, an ought conclusion, a moral conclusion. Now we just need a non-moral is statement as one of the premises. Because there's still a gap in this argument, even though it's not an is-ought gap. The gap is that you leap from killing innocent human beings is wrong to abortion is wrong. You need to fill it in somehow. What would you propose? I think the proper thing to propose is that abortion kills an innocent human being. All right, now look at the argument we have. Premise 1, abortion kills an innocent human being. Premise 2, it is morally wrong to kill innocent human beings. Conclusion, therefore abortion is morally wrong. So we were missing a non-moral is statement. Now we've got a decent argument where the conclusion follows from the premises. What component is missing from the structure of the following moral argument? Stealing is wrong. Taking other people's property is stealing. Are we missing a non-moral is statement? Are we missing a premise that supplies a moral rule, principle, or command? Or are we missing a conclusion that a specific action should be performed? You can pause if you need to. We're missing the conclusion. We have a premise that is a non-moral is statement. The premise that is a non-moral is statement is this one. Taking other people's property is stealing. Alright, that's a non-moral is statement. We have a premise that supplies a moral rule, principle, or command. Stealing is wrong. Now we just need the conclusion. The conclusion that a specific action should be performed or not performed. Therefore, you shouldn't steal. Something like that. Therefore, you shouldn't take another person's property. Okay? Taking another person's property is stealing. Stealing is wrong. Therefore, you shouldn't take another person's property. Okay, now we've got a decent argument where the conclusion follows from the premises. We've got the is statement, the moral principle, and the conclusion, which specifies the moral action to take or not to take. Now, this whole section on moral arguments has been in our section on induction. But I'm not sure why Stan Barnett places this chapter in induction, because moral arguments can be deductive or inductive, right? Moral arguments can be deductive or inductive. So I'm not sure why he places this chapter in the section on induction. Okay, remember that a deductive argument is an argument in which it is claimed that the truth of the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion. And an inductive argument is an argument in which it is claimed that the truth of the premises make the truth of the conclusion more probable than not. Well, a moral argument can be deductive or inductive. Let me show you how. Here's a deductively valid moral argument. It is wrong to kill human beings. Alice is a human being. Therefore, it is wrong to kill Alice. Supposing the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. But arguments can also be inductively strong. Moral arguments can also be inductively strong. Here's an example. In most cases, it is wrong for one human to kill another. Maybe it's not wrong in war or self-defense or capital punishment, whatever. Premise 2. Alice killed a human being. Premise 3. Therefore, what Alice did was wrong. Alright, so what makes it inductive is that it has the word most. Given the truth of the premises, the conclusion is probably true. Alright? Okay, so the point of that being, we've given you the structure of moral arguments, and we've shown how moral arguments can either be deductive or inductive.